Good day, everyone. Welcome once again to Education 505 Research Seminar and Practicum. In this video lecture, I will discuss the topic, how to write a thesis statement. This video lecture is part of a series of video lectures on how to write a thesis or dissertation proposal as a final requirements of the course Research Seminar and Practicum. As you can see in my first slide, there are three major points that I will cover in this discussion. First is on a brief discussion on the meaning, nature, and dynamics of a thesis statement. And then I will proceed to a brief discussion on some of the techniques in writing a thesis statement. And then the discussion ends with a presentation and a discussion of a sample of a thesis statement. So let me proceed with the first one. So, by the way, what I do here, just like I did in my other video lectures, I wrote my notes so that I won't miss any important points related to the topic. And if necessary, I do some side discussion. So that's what I will do here. Read my notes, do some side discussion, read my notes, do some side discussion. So what is a thesis statement? By the way, I always start with discussing the meaning, nature, and dynamics of something because I believe that it's always a good idea that before we teach our students the how of anything, like how to write a thesis statement, I always have the habit of teaching them the what and the why. Because I believe that if the student knows exactly what they are doing and why they're doing it, then the how will become easy for them. So although the main trajectory of this discussion is on the how of writing thesis statements, but we start with the discussion on what really is a thesis statement and why the need for it. Okay, so what is a thesis statement? Broadly construed, a thesis statement is a statement or a declarative sentence that summarizes the main idea or central points of a research paper or essay. So I wrote here research paper or essay because in literary writing, for example, we always have that, especially in essay writing, we always develop the thesis statements of our literary peers. And in research papers and in research writing as a whole, there is always the need to articulate the thesis statement because most of the time the thesis statement serves as the compelling reason as to why the need to conduct the research. Okay. The thesis statement identifies the topic to be discussed as well as the purpose of the paper or the research paper or the essay. And most importantly, the thesis statement clearly makes an assertion and communicates to the reader the position the author has taken on the topic. I will show later why the need to clearly show to our readers when writing, when doing research, the importance of showing to our readers our position, our argument, our contention, our claim as to why the need to do this research. Because again, as I will show later, as researchers, we need to show the compelling reason why we want to do that research. Because aside from the fact that there is a problem to be solved and this problem needs to be solved, the problem needs urgent consideration, we also have to convince our readers that look, there is a huge arguments, there is a huge arguments that need to be considered. Yeah, I will explain that further again when we go to the importance of writing or articulating your thesis statement clearly, articulating the thesis statement clearly in your thesis proposal or thesis or research paper or your essay. Put simply, the thesis statement is a signpost telling the readers what the research paper or essay will argue and why. And this is very important because as I reiterated many times in my other lectures on research writing, that when we write scholarly papers, we write in a narrative and argumentative manner. We are always making a position and arguments, contentions, and so all throughout the thesis, all throughout the dissertation, all throughout your research paper are arguments or positions about particular, context and issues and controversies and things like that. So there are arguments all throughout the paper. We're developing positions and contentions and interpretations, but we have to see to it that these arguments that we develop in the body of our research are in line with the main arguments that we articulate in the background of the study, which we call the thesis statement. Okay. It must be noted that in thesis or dissertation writing, the thesis statement is normally placed towards the end of the background of the study or the rationale of the study. I will provide a proof later when on this point when I go to the last part of this presentation on the sample of a thesis statement. So I will read a brief background of the study or a brief rationale of the study, highlighting the thesis statements towards the end of the paper. And it must also be noted that the beginning or early part of the background of the study provides the readers with the background information needed for them to fully understand the thesis statements and the entire paper or research paper as a whole. So why the need for a thesis statement? Why bother articulate articulating your thesis statements in the background of the study? And why do thesis committee members or panel members look for this in the background of the study, to the point that if you miss this part in the background of the study or in your rationale of the study, some panel members will reject your paper. So why the need for a thesis statement? As the statement that states the main idea of the paper, a thesis statement is important because, among other things, and I enumerated 5 here, but you can have more than 5 importance of the thesis statements that I just summarized, or I just presented 5 here. First is, a thesis statement helps control the flow of ideas in the research paper or essay. As I already mentioned again a while ago, that in scholarly writing or in research writing, we always develop arguments, positions, interpretations in the body of the thesis and in the conclusion and recommendation part. So we write in a narrative, conversational, and argumentative manner. And so since we develop a lot of interpretations, arguments, positions, claims, contentions in the research per se, then we have to see to it again that these arguments are in line with the overarching arguments of the paper, which you articulate in a form of a thesis statements in the background of the study. So again, the thesis statement helps control the flow of ideas in the research paper or essay. Second, it provides readers with a clear idea of what the researcher or author will discuss in the body of the research. This is quite related to number 1, self-explanatory, but the idea here is with the thesis statement, the reader, your readers or your panel members will know what you will do in the body of the research. And yeah, they can anticipate what you will discuss there, and so that your reader will not get lost in reading your paper or your research paper. Third, it lets the readers know immediately what the research paper is all about. Well, we have, of course, the working title, which captures the main idea of the paper, the key concepts and the variables if you're doing quantitative research. And then you have the research problem or research gap, and then you have the research goal. Of course, this will give you an idea of what the research is all about. But with the thesis statement, because again in the fifth one, because it serves us, or it articulates the compelling reason of your paper, then with that main contention, with that main argument, with that main position, the readers or your readers will have a clear idea of what you will do, or what the research is all about. Okay. And then fourth, it shows the stance that the author holds regarding the topic under investigation. So that's quite self-explanatory and quite similar to number four, number three. And most importantly, the thesis statement articulates the compelling reason for the conduct of the research. I put more emphasis on this on number five, because when we do research or when we write essays, there is always, most particularly when you do research, there is always a reason behind our move to do it. And so, as I mentioned in my other video lectures, especially on how to write the background of the study and problem formulation and gap spotting, I mentioned there many times that there is no research without a research problem, that we do not do research because we want to complete the master's program or the PhD program, or we do research because it's a requirement in our profession as teachers, as professors. Well, yes, that's part of the package deal, but the main reason why we do research is because there is a problem out there that needs to be addressed. There is a serious problem that needs urgent consideration. There is a gap in knowledge that needs to be filled. And so, in other words, we do research because there's a compelling reason why we need to do it. And so, again, it is the thesis statement that articulates the compelling reason why you wish to pursue that research project. And please take notes, as I mentioned, as I hinted a while ago, that sometimes this is the reason why, if you miss to articulate your thesis statement, some of your panel members or thesis committee members will reject your thesis. Because in the first place, there's no need, if you miss to articulate the thesis statements, then it shows that there's no reason for the conduct of this research. And when I review papers, because I'm a regular reviewer in several prestigious journals out there, and I sit many times as a panel members, when I read the background of the study of a thesis or dissertation, when I read the rationale of the study or background or introduction, I am always looking for three major points, aside from the styles of writing and technicalities of writing and things like that. I will check that later. But when I read the background of the study, I immediately look for what the research is all about, okay? The problem that the researcher would want to see addressed in the thesis or in the research project, why the need for this research, the research goal, and the thesis statements. Okay. But most of the time, three major points: research problem or research gap, research goal, and thesis statements. If one of these is missing, then chances are the thesis proposal or dissertation proposal will receive a major revision as a recommendation from my end as member of the thesis committee or the panel. Okay, so I hope with this five reasons, with this 5 reasons, you know exactly, you now understand why there is a need to articulate your thesis statement clearly in the background of your study, and why and why the need for this video lecture on thesis statement as part of, again, a series of lectures on how to write a thesis or dissertation proposal. And now, how do we write the thesis statement? So I'm now moving to the second major part of this lecture on the discussion on some of the important techniques in writing a thesis statement. I will present 2 models here of writing a thesis statement. The first that I will present is the style, or yeah, the technique that is commonly used in literary writing, in essay writing, for example. And then the second technique um, will deal with with the common technique that researchers employ in developing their thesis statement in their thesis, dissertation, or research paper. So the first one for for the development of a thesis statement in general, most particularly in literary writing, and then the second is technique on how to write the thesis statements in research per se. Okay, so how do we write the thesis statements? So this is the first um, technique for essay writing, for example. So I have 2 slides for this, and then I have 1 slide for how to write the thesis statements in research writing or in thesis or dissertation. So let me start with this. So first is you raise a question. For example, you may say, should the government provide educational assistance to low-income students? And then after raising or asking the question, then second step is you create a declaration out of that question. For example, you may say, the government should provide educational assistance to low-income students. And then in the third step, you list 2 to 3 reasons why the government should provide educational assistance to low-income students. For example, you may say, first argument is, or first reason is, the government has the obligation to provide for the needs of its constituents, particularly, most especially, the students. And second reason is, the students will be able to focus on their studies, finish on time, land on a decent job, and become valuable members of the country's workforce. That's the third step. Now, the fourth and last step involves a combination of steps 2 and 3. So in the fourth step, you combine steps 2 and 3 and then write the thesis statement. It now reads, for example, the government should provide educational assistance to low-income students because, in the first place, the government has the obligation to provide for the needs of its constituents, particularly the students. More importantly, if the low-income students are provided with the necessary assistance, they will be able to focus on their studies, finish on time, land on a decent job, and become valuable members of the country's workforce. So as you can see, this is your position as the author, as the writer, as the researcher. This is your argument. This is the compelling reasons, or this is the compelling reason why there is a need to write this piece of literature, this essay. Okay? So I hope that's clear. So you can, of course, if I move quite fast, you can just rewind the discussion on this part. Let me proceed to the second technique in writing thesis statements in research writing cover. I have a one-page slide for this discussion. So as you notice, you have it here, working title, research problem or research gap, and then I have the research goal, and then the thesis statements. By the way, this is part of our discussion on problem formulation, or how to identify or how to formulate the research problem. So this is a one-page research problem or research gap, but as you notice, it includes the research goal and the thesis statement. And again, this is just one page, but it took me quite some time to develop this one-page research gap, because as I mentioned in my video lecture, problem formulation, or how to identify or how to formulate the research problem, and the second video lecture, gap spotting, or how to identify a research gap. Problem formulation or gap spotting is the most difficult part in research, believe me. That all research begins with problem formulation or gap spotting. And we have the cliche that goes, once we have identified the problem of your proposed research, or once we have identified the gap of your proposed research, then the research is halfway done. You know exactly what to do now because you have now identified the problem. You know what to address. And so you know what to do, research goal. You know the argument why you need to do it. And so therefore, writing the background of the study and all other parts of your thesis or dissertation is quite easy because you already have a clear direction of your research. Because again, the problem, this one-page research gap or research problem, sets the sail of your research journey. So if you want to know more about problem formulation or gap spotting, you might as well refer to my other video lectures. I provided the link to those lectures in the description below. So let me proceed. As you can see, again, the thesis statement is on the last parts, but this is a one-page research gap or research problem. This is part of my discussion in the course methods of research and research seminar and practicum. So for those students who are not under me in research method, I go back to the discussion on problem formulation, although that's one of the topics in research methods, because again, in research seminar and practicum, wherein students are required to produce a thesis proposal at the end of the course, we cannot proceed with the writing of the thesis proposal. We can begin with the writing of the research proposal if we don't have a problem or a research gap in the first place. So this is how we do it. Okay, so and lastly, before I proceed, I will provide another video lecture on how to make or how to frame your working title, because the working title requires some skills, knowledge, and how to do it, because it's not just the working title should not be framed from the vantage point of aesthetics, but in scholarly writing, in thesis, or in research writing, there are rules of thumb to follow in doing it. So I will make a separate video lecture on that. But in this case, let me just read the working title, the research gap, and the research goal, discuss it a bit, and then I will explain the thesis statement at the end of the day. So the working title of this proposed research is Knowledge and Attitude Among Sugarcane Farmers in Negros Island Toward Climate Change. And then what's the problem? What's the gap of knowledge, or what's really the problem that I want to see addressed in this proposed research? Let me just read this one. The researcher observes that sugarcane farmers in Negros Island continue to perform the antiquated practice of burning residual sugarcane leaves after harvest. This practice is done in the face of Ecological Solid Waste Management Act, or RA 9003, and Clean Air Act, or RA 8749, that prohibits and penalize open burning of waste, which is defined as the thermal destruction of waste by means of direct exposure to fire. As we can see, if this practice is left unchecked, it will not only cause air pollution, but also damage our ozone layer, which in turn will contribute to climate change. Actually, the last sentence is already a thesis statement in itself, but I fully developed that in the section on the thesis statement part. So that is the problem that I wish to address in my research. So just very briefly, just a very brief discussion on this. So the idea here is look, there are already policies about the burning of residual sugarcane leaves after harvest. There's already a policy or law on open burning of waste, at least in the Philippines. So that is, yeah. And then despite the existence of these policies, of these laws, the sugarcane farmers in Negros Island, in central Philippines, continue to burn, these um, residual sugarcane leaves after harvest. And so the act does not only go against the policy or the law, but also at the same time, may contribute in climate change, and it will also damage the ozone layer and so on and so forth. So as you can see, there is a serious problem here, and um, and and as you can see, um, before I just to preempt the discussion on the thesis statement, of course. And so there is a need for us to know the knowledge and attitude of the sugarcane farmers in Negros Island towards climate change, so that we will be able to address the problem. So that once we know how they behave, for example, how they perceive the, the, the the policy and things like that, then as researchers, we will be in the best position to offer some solutions, strategies, recommendations that we will develop in the recommendation part of our research paper, that will help policymakers address the problem. So here we can clearly see the research gap or the research problem. And since we have already the research gap, then we can now develop the research goal. And research goal or research aim reads: this proposed research aims to determine the knowledge and attitude of sugarcane farmers in Negros Island toward climate change. Okay, so at this point we know exactly what the problem is that the researcher would like to see addressed in this paper, and second is we know already what he or she will do, the aim of the research. But we are left with one last question: why the need to determine the knowledge and attitude of sugarcane farmers in Negros Island towards climate change? Why the need to do this research? And so in research writing, developing the thesis statement is quite easy, because once you already have the research problem and the research goal, then you will ask yourself as researcher, what is my position in this case? What is my argument? What is the stance that I take on this topic? Or in short, what is the compelling reason for the conduct of this research? And that's the task of the thesis statement. That's what you will develop in the thesis statement section. So let me read the thesis statements. You may say, the researcher argues, or you may say, the researcher claims, or you may say, the researcher contends that if we know the knowledge and attitude of the sugarcane farmers in Negros Island toward climate change, as well as local and international policies on climate change, such as RA 9003 and RA 8749, he or she will be in the best position to offer some alternative solutions to the problem, in a form, of course, of strategy, recommendation, or suggestions in the recommendation parts of the research paper. Also, Through a deep understanding of the said farmer's knowledge and attitude toward climate change, the researcher will be able to develop and recommend actions, guidelines to bridge the gap between policy formulation and policy implementation. Let me explain very briefly the last statement. Because look, as you can see in the research gap, there seems to be a gap between policy formulation and policy implementation. Because look, there is already a policy that says no to open burning of waste. And as you can see, in reality, sugarcane farmers, most of them in Negros Oriental and Negros Occidental, most of the farmers, the sugarcane farmers, they're burning the residual sugarcane leaves after harvest. And so there seems to be an inconsistency. There's between, a gap between policy formulation and policy implementation. And so, as researchers, as concerned citizens, for example, we want to know the knowledge and attitude of the farmers because, in the first place, maybe these farmers do not know these policies. Okay, and so when I conduct a case study on this case, I will go to the field, talk to the farmers, observe what's going on out there, explore the nature and dynamics of the problem, and then once I know that indeed the farmers do not know the policy, then I can recommend for example, a massive information campaign on the part of the farmers. I will recommend that LGUs or yeah, the barangays or the barangay officials or the government officials in that locality should conduct massive information campaign on climate change, on related topics, so that farmers will be informed about recent trends in development and climate change. And so that at the end of the day, as a research outcome, the impact of the research in the long run, then farmers will stop burning residual sugarcane leaves after harvest. On the other hand, for example, this is just an example. On the other hand, after I conducted the case study on this problem, after I went to the fields and talked to the farmers and observed what's going on around, I learned as a researcher, I learned that these farmers are knowledgeable about climate change, about the policies, RA 9003 and things like that. However, they could not fully implement, or they could, however, they continue to burn those residual sugarcane leaves after harvest because that was the instruction of the owner of the farm. Because in Negros, we know that the Negros Island is the sugar capital of the Philippines. It was once called the sugar bowl of 12 Eurasia, and there are hundreds of haciendas there in Negros Island. And the farmers are simply, we call that, many of them are called sacadas. They are famously called sacadas. They are just farmers. They are workers. They're paid on a daily basis by the hacienderos, by the owners, by the planters. And so, even if the farmers know about the policy, they continue to do so. They continue to burn sugarcane leaves after harvest because that was the instruction of the owners. And maybe, for example, if you push the idea further, I suppose in the case study I learned as a researcher that the owners of the planters themselves, or many of the owners of these sugarcane these haciendas, are also politicians, are also mayors, councillors, congressmen. And so that we could not implement the policy properly, because in the first place, the first victim of the policy will be the policy implementers themselves. And so if that is the findings, or if that's one of the findings of the research, that some of the owners of the haciendas of the sugarcane plantations are also government officials, then I could recommend as researcher that it's about time that the national government should intervene because there is inconsistency here. There is a gap between policy formulation and policy implementation. Or in other words, there's a problem in terms of policy implementation in Negros Island because the local officials are also the owners of the haciendas. So you see the importance of doing research and policy research in this case, and the importance of articulating your thesis statements, the compelling reason as to why you need to pursue this research. So with this thesis statements, okay, if I am the reader, if I am the panel member or member of a thesis committee, I know exactly why the researcher is so passionate about pursuing this research. Or I know exactly why the researcher would like to do this. And if all of these important points are found in the background of the study, then what else shall we look for as members of the panel? You know, there is no revision. But if one of these major points are missing in the background of the study or in the introductory part of your thesis or dissertation, then most probably you will receive a major revision as recommendation from the panel. So I hope I'm able to fully explain to you the importance, what a thesis statement is and the importance of a thesis statement. And I hope with this discussion on the techniques on how to write the thesis statements, you know now how to develop your own thesis statement. And so thank you, but I will now, yeah, this is the end of the second part. I will now proceed to the last part of this video lecture. I will present a concrete sample of a brief background of the study where I developed the thesis statement. So let me stop sharing and share another sample. Okay, so this is the sample of a background of the study that I presented in my other video lecture on how to write um, a video lecture on I forgot the title on how to write the thesis statement. No, it's not a thesis statement. Well, anyway, I provide this in my other video lecture that talks about how to write a thesis proposal, dissertation proposal. I provided this sample. So I'll present this again here. I will read this background of the study and then show you at the end of the day how I develop the thesis statements and where I place it. And before I read, let me show this one. So as you can see, let me slowly scroll down. So this is the background of the study. And there at the end, towards the end of the background of the study, I developed there the thesis statement. So let me read this sample and do some side discussion. But just to recall what we discussed a while ago, that the thesis statements, as I mentioned in the early parts of this video presentation, the thesis statement is placed normally towards the end of the background of the study or towards the end of the rationale of the study. And I also mentioned that it's developed towards the end of the background of the study because the thesis statements normally follows the context of the research and then the research problem or research gap and then research goal. And again, take notes when I review, not just me, but expert reviewers out there, when they sit as a panel members in a thesis defense, when they review sections of the papers, and when they review the background of the study, they always look for these three major points. The problem, again and again, the problem that the researcher would want to see addressed in the paper, the research goal, and third, the thesis statement. So I will highlight these three major points here. Okay. But as I mentioned in my other video lecture, will I use the sample before we articulate the research problem? We provided first a context of the study. Okay. Anyway, let me read this one. Okay. The working title is Lived Experiences of Police Officers in the Visayas Regions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the background of the study reads, as I discussed in my other video lecture, sometimes we call this simply, sometimes we call this just background of the study. Some universities in Europe use background of the study and problem statement, and some universities in the United States have the format which only use statements of the problem. So there's no one size fits all here in terms of framing the background of the study or the statement of the problem, or the rationale of the study. What is important again and again is that these three major points are found in this piece of literature, in this section of the thesis. The problem that the researcher wants to address, the research goal or research aim, and the thesis statements. Okay? Among other things, are minor for me. These are just the three major things that we will look for in the background of the study. Okay, let me continue. And again, in the first two paragraphs, we provide a context of the problem or the study, but we already mentioned in passing the research problem. You take note of this. So it reads, as we can observe, the COVID-19 pandemic has reshaped the global socio-economic and political landscape. In fact, in economic terms, according to Babday and Ray, the global GDP growth for 2020 has been projected to shrink by half a percentage point. It is from 2.9% to 2.4%. As a result, corporations, businesses, and industries need to reduce employments or temporarily close their doors to sustain their operations. It is also important to note that many of them were cash-strapped at the start of the pandemic, which means that either they will have to drastically cut expenses, take on more loans, or file for bankruptcy. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has negatively affected global business operations. So before we go into the specificity of the problem or research problem, the problem of this proposed research, we provided the context of the problem. We show the overall problem, which is the impacts of the pandemic on a global scale, most specifically in the socio-economic and political landscape. And then the second paragraph push the idea further. We continue to provide a clear context of the problem, and it reads, the same economic repercussions brought about by the pandemic can be observed in the Philippines. And so from the global to the local, from the general to the particular, we move from the global to the Philippines in this case. In fact, the National Economic Development Authority reported that an estimated $86 billion in economic output was lost in 2020 alone, according to Masigan. One major reason for this is that micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises represents the backbone of the Philippine economy, which are directly vulnerable to external shocks such as financial crisis, natural disasters, and changing business conditions. As Shinozaki and Rao observed, most MSMEs lack adequate funding to remain in business after lockdowns. So from this, general context, or from this context, we now move to the discussion now moves to the problem of this research. Okay. And so I am now, so the first two paragraphs I presented the context of the study, the background of the study of the problem, and then now I'm now moving to the research problem. Think of the one-page research gap, working title, and then research problem. I'm now discussing here the research problem, and it reads, while the adverse impact of the COVID-19 pandemic can be directly felt in the economic aspects, one cannot deny the fact that its impact is multi-layered. Indeed, the pandemic has also taken a toll on the psycho-emotional and social well-being of the people, most especially those who are working on the front lines and fighting the pandemic, such as the health workers and the police officers. So you see, I transition from the general to the particular. As you notice, if you look at the working title, I'm talking about the lived experiences of police officers in the Visayas regions during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will be dealing with the experiences of these frontliners. And so in the discussion below, in the problem here, so I now move to the overall, you know, uh, psycho-emotional and social well-being of the people as a whole. But I zeroed in on the frontliners, health workers, and the police officers, but I zeroed in further on the police officers. So you see how my background of the study is in line with the title or the working title of the proposed research. Let me continue. In fact, according to the World Health Organization, going to work during this COVID-19 pandemic has placed frontline workers under immense and unprecedented pressure, putting their physical, mental, and social well-being at risk. According to the WHO, if exposed to excessive stress due to prolonged periods of work, then these frontline workers may experience mental disorders such as depression, anxiety, which in turn result in unhealthy behaviors like excessive smoking, drinking, and even substance abuse. So you can see how valid my observation is, how valid the problem is that I want to see addressed in this paper, because it is corroborated by no less than the World Health Organization. So that's the research problem that I want to address in this research. Okay? And then I proceed. This explains why Billings and others in their work title experiences of frontline healthcare workers and their views about support during COVID-19 and previous pandemics as systematic review and qualitative metasynthesis argue that we need to learn from the experiences of the frontline workers, so we will not only provide moral and medical support to them, but also come up with strategies to address a problem in case it may arise again in the future. And after stating the problem, the research problem or the research gap, I now articulate the research goal. Working title, research problem or research gap, research goal, and the thesis statements. And then the research um, goal or research aim reads, it is for this reason, therefore, that this proposed policy research aims to determine the lived experiences of police officers in the Eastern Visayas regions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I push the idea further, or I contextualize the goal of the research. Aside from the problem, I provided another argument or another context for that, which reads, based on, and this will serve as a proof to my claim, based on the initial interviews with some of the police officers in Tacloban City, the researchers found out that many of the said police officers have been facing difficulties and challenges during the COVID-19 pandemic, most especially in their effort to keep the communities safe from the deadly virus. In fact, many of them felt that their physical health is most at risk when they are assigned in checkpoint areas. This paranoia has been compounded by the sad news that of the 41,701 police officers infected by the virus as of 27 October 2021, the death toll stands at 123. Indeed, we can only imagine how stressed our police officers are because of this pandemic. So you see, we have a research goal here, and then as part, of course, of the research problem, and then we explain further the research problem, and this provides the proof and context to our research goal. Now, after stating the research goal and explaining the problem further, we close the discussion of the background of the study or the rationale of the study with the thesis statements. So this is where I develop my or this is where I develop the compelling reason for the conduct of this research. This is where I develop my position as a researcher. This is where I develop my argument, my contentions, my position, my stance on the on the topic under investigation. Or in other words, this is where I articulate the thesis statements of my study. And it reads, if this problem is left unchecked, then we run the risk of putting our police officers at extreme mental and physical risk, which may result in depression, poor performance of their duties, and other related risks. Again, this rationale motivates the researchers to determine the lived experiences of police officers in the Visayas regions during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is premised on the idea that once the researchers know the difficulties and challenges that these police officers encountered in the discharge of their duties during the pandemic, then they will be in the best position to offer alternatives or solutions to the problem. That's our thesis statement. Take notes. As I mentioned before, the thesis statements can be, there's two ways to frame the thesis statements. It could be expository in manner, and second is it could be argumentative. In this case, I frame our thesis statement because I have a co-researcher here. We frame our thesis statement from the vantage in an argumentative manner. Okay, so and then after that, so of course, after the thesis statements, you may now read your research questions. You may now write the research questions now. Yeah, because what I would like to say that in the early part of this, the discussion of this sample is what I was trying to say is in my previous lecture I discussed about how to formulate a research problem actually. Okay, so this is how to formulate the thesis, the statement of the problem, not the thesis statement, statements of the problem. And so the research questions now reads, this is part of the background of the study. And for more discussion and reason behind why I have this format, please refer to my previous or my other video lectures titled how to write the statements of the problem. So after the thesis statements, you may now write your research questions. And again, the research questions are not the same with the statement of the problem. The research questions read, or the research question section reads, this study will be guided with the following questions. 1, what are the challenges and difficulties that the police officers in the Visayas regions encountered during the pandemic? And 2, how do these police officers cope with the problem? Okay, so yeah, so much for the discussion on how to write the thesis statements. And I hope with this sample of a background of a study which clearly articulates the thesis statements, you now know exactly what a thesis statement is and why the need to do it. And most importantly, you now know how to write your thesis statements or the thesis statement of your research. Okay, that's all for now. See you in my next video lectures. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.